News Talk 850 WFTL presents Joyce Kaufman, No Restraint. Here's Joyce Kaufman.
Well, it's really been quite a week. What with the Rittenhouse verdict, which I believe was a just verdict. But of course, the country's divided. It's divided on everything, so why wouldn't it be divided on the Rittenhouse verdict? But there's also a lot more going on. A lot more that's just sort of under the surface, but that's starting to bubble up. And I think it should be paid careful attention. You know, whether it's a couple of never-Trumpers deciding to leave Fox because Tucker Carlson had the audacity to put out a 3-day documentary about whether or not it was an insurrection on January 6th, which most of us believe it might have been poorly conceived, but it was anything but an armed insurrection. So last Monday, this Democrat firm hosted some focus groups with women in Virginia. Women who voted in 2017 for the Democrat, Ralph Northam, who voted in 2020 for the Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden, and then this last month voted for Republican governor-elect Glenn Youngkin. And it was centered on suburban women, a group that has pivoted significantly to the right in the governor's election. The consultant from Anvil Strategies, Danny Barefoot, called roughly 30,000 people in Virginia, and most of them didn't answer. But several hundred of them did fit the criteria that he was looking for. People who voted Democrat again, and then voted Republican in the last 3 elections. And those people, they were called back, and they were offered a $100 gift card if they would do a lunch hour Zoom meeting and talk about it. Why did they vote the way they did? 96 women, a full fifth of whom were not white, were broken into 3 different sessions. And Danny Barefoot sat in on one of them, and he got permission from the funders to share some of the quotes and some of the results of this poll. Focus groups are put together differently than surveys, which weigh the responses to reflect the population at large. And while 96 respondents isn't enough for like a polling sample, it is a chance to dig deeper into the views of a portion of the electorate. Virginia is about 2/3 white, and this sample was about 79% white, so slightly whiter than the state at large, but not by a ton. 11% of them were black women, 6% were Latina, and 4% were Asian American. And they came from around the state. Danny Barefoot said he didn't talk about or ask about college education because he was interested in what people who lived in the suburbs, regardless of race or educational background, were thinking. And what he found is while the women agreed with Democrats on policy, they just didn't connect with them. When asked which party had better policy proposals, the group members overwhelmingly said Democrats. But when asked which party had cultural values closer to theirs, they cited Republicans. The biggest disconnect came on education. Danny Barefoot found that school closures were likely a very big part of their votes for Youngkin, and that frustration at the leadership of schools over the closures bled into the controversy, which they say may have been pushed by Republicans around the injection of critical race theory into the public school setting, along with the question of what say parents should have in schools. One Latina woman talked about how remote school foisted so much work on parents, and yet later Terry McAuliffe, who was the Democratic nominee and the former governor, would insist that parents should have no input in their child's education. Well, that's not exactly what he said, but that's how it played out to these people. And as she put it, they asked us to do all this work for months and then say it's none of our business now. The anger they felt at Democrats for the Commonwealth's COVID-19 school closure policy became further evidence of a cultural gap between these working people and the elites in the Democratic Party, who broadly supported prolonged school closures while enjoying the opportunity to work remotely. Those with means decamped. Enrollment in Fairfax County schools dropped 5% and fell by 3.9% and 3.4% in Arlington and Loudoun counties, respectively. Those who were left behind organized parents' groups to pressure the schools to reopen. Though the groups tended to be nonpartisan or bipartisan at the start, Republican donors and conservative groups poured money and manpower into them, converting them into potent political weapons that blended anger at the closures with complaints about Democratic board members prioritizing trendy social justice issues, all of it aimed at the November elections. They kept saying a strong return to school, but there's no details, said Sandra Davis on Fox News over the summer, co-founder of one large group called the Open Fairfax Public Schools Coalition. Their attention was on other things, like their pet projects and social justice issues, and the kids have been left to flounder, and there's still no plan for the fall. You'll be surprised to know I'm a Democrat, she said in the focus group. I've tried to warn them that there's a bipartisan tidal wave coming their way. They didn't look us in the eye. They didn't write us back. If we can't recall them one by one, well, there's an election in November. And that fall, Davis cut an ad for Youngkin, citing his commitment to keep schools open as a decisive factor. And while the group made a Democrat angry at Democrats, the face of its opposition, because behind her was a coterie of Republican operatives, the bulk of the group's financing came from N2 America, a conservative nonprofit, and Republican gubernatorial candidate Pete Snyder. Its co-founder was a Republican who lost the 2019 race for school board, and the rest of its officers were Republican operatives too. A pretty slick nonprofit named Parents Defending Education was launched in 2020 to help guide the local groups. Little effort was made to conceal who was behind it. A longtime Koch network operative, Nicole Neely, was placed at the helm of the grassroots organization. And aside from Davis, nearly every mom and dad brought into Fox News to complain about critical race theory held a day job as a senior Republican operative. It was the purest expression of the way Republicans have driven the fight over schools and then capitalized on it. The fear of public schools indoctrinating our children has been a theme for the Republican Party and for its base voters for decades. But in the wake of Trump's rise, the party watched in horror as suburban voters recoiled from Republicans into the arms of Democrats, casting about for an issue that would win some of them back. Recall that this is a game of margins, not absolutes. The party landed on schools. Around the country, conservative media, and just parent groups, which were unrivaled by any Democrat groups, gave air cover to the schooling issue, handing local activists language to use, a story to tell, and the resources and platform to tell it. The tactic was even more potent in Northern Virginia, where many professional Republicans and lobbyists live. In Loudoun County this November, McAuliffe outpaced Youngkin 55% to 44%, but Biden had beaten Trump there by 62% to 37%. Youngkin's showing was only 11,000 votes fewer than Trump won a year earlier, while McAuliffe notched 50,000 fewer votes than Biden had. While Biden carried Fairfax by 42 points, McAuliffe only took it by 31. And that the GOP didn't make even bigger inroads, given their heavy investment in this issue, may be the only silver lining for Democrats, who, witnessing an AstroTurf campaign take shape and get twisted beyond all recognition, decided, perhaps understandably, but to their later regret, to ignore the question. After McAuliffe's debate gaffe in which he delivered up the perfect soundbite to Youngkin, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach," He took weeks to respond, initially not even recognizing the danger. Everybody clapped when I said it, McAuliffe insisted later. Even where Republicans spent heavily against outmatched Democrats, they only made marginal gains in school board races. But if the issue continues to go uncontested, their luck is going to run out. National Democrats have no coordinated response yet, leaving school board members unstaffed, underfunded, borderline volunteers hung out to dry with nothing to rely on but mainstream media assertions that there's no there. Don't look over here. There's no critical race theory. In the Virginia election, two arguments that have been running parallel in Democratic circles for the past several years finally collided. One is the question of how Democrats should position themselves in the ongoing culture war, with jockeying over fraught and contested concepts like wokeness and cancel culture. Critical race theory is one example of this. Democrats can't seem to agree on whether it's a good thing that should be taught and defended, or a Republican fabrication that it's not being taught in elementary schools at all. And the other is the round and round debate over race and class. Are voters who flee Democratic's party motivated more by economic anxiety or by racial resentment and eroding white privilege? While these debates are going on, Democrats have seen a steady erosion in support among working class voters of all races, while gathering support among the more highly educated voters. That movement would point towards class divisions driving voter behavior. But the rearing up of critical race theory as a central plank of the Republican Party appears to throw the question open again. Maybe it is racism. That's what they're going to say, right? Properly understanding how different voting blocs understand the terms of the debate unlocks the contradiction. The culture war is not a proxy for race. It's a proxy for class. The Democratic problem with working class voters goes far beyond white people. Now, for the portion of the Republican base heavily disposed to racial prejudice, the culture war and issues like critical race theory, well, they easily work, calling people to the polls. But for many voters, and not just white voters, critical race theory is in a basket with other cultural microaggressions that are directed at working people by the elites that they see as running the Democratic Party. For instance, one of the women in the focus group said, when she was asked if Democrats share their cultural values, she said, "They fight for the right things, and I usually vote for them, but they believe some crazy things. Sometimes I feel like if I don't know the right words for things, they think I am a bigot." These results rhymed with the conclusions of a memo that was put out by the strategist Andrew Levison, who has long made the argument that Democratic efforts at connecting with the working class voters are fundamentally flawed. The memo, which was published after the Virginia election, but not directly responding to the election, looks at how Democrats can win support among a growing number of anti-Trump Republicans. Rather than convince the entire white working class, which is typically approximated in polls by looking for white voters without a college degree, Levison argues that Democrats should identify a distinct, persuadable sector of the white working class and then figure out how to get members of that specific group to vote Democratic. Levison, citing data from multiple election cycles, notes that Democrats roughly win about a third of white working class votes. The party loses about a third right out of the gate. Hardcore right-wing people who would never consider voting for Democrats and think even a Democrat like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, known for much of his career as Wall Street Chuck, is a flaming socialist and a traitor. Levison calls that third extremists and argues that they're not gettable under any circumstances. He distinguishes them from the final third, which is made up of what he calls cultural traditionalists. His category of cultural traditionalists, he acknowledged, is not meant to capture every voter who is gettable by Democrats. Likewise, many cultural traditionalists have competing and conflicting views on various issues. But just as corporations work to create consumer profiles before going to market with an ad campaign, Democrats need to define who that persuadable person among the white working class is. And to do so, Levison relies on years of survey data, much of it collected by Working America, which is an affiliate of the AFL-CIO that does tens of thousands of in-person interviews with working class people around the country each year, looking to identify those who are persuadable. As Levison defines them, cultural traditionalists are people who don't follow the news closely, but have an easygoing personality and an open mind, contrasted with cranky, short-tempered people who are more likely to fall into the extremist category. They believe in patriotism and the American way of life, but also believe that diversity and pluralism and tolerance are essential characteristics of that American way of life. When it comes to race, these traditionalists have something of a Michael Scott view, rooted in the cliché that they don't see race or they don't see color. They also have religious and moral values they happily describe as old-fashioned, but say they have no problem with people who have different views. When these voters shifted their views on marriage equality, accepting it as something that ought to be legal even if they were skeptical of it, the dam had broken. Meanwhile, they think that the Democrats are a party that primarily represents social groups, like educated liberals and racial or ethnic minorities, while having very little interest, understanding, or very little concern for ordinary white people. That's right, working class white people. And Levison's distinction between these cultural traditionalists and what he calls the extremists, except for the last part, can plausibly apply to many, many Black and Latino working class people as well. And even that last part, that Democrats don't have much interest or concern for ordinary white working people specifically, is not really a value judgment. It's a widespread interpretation of Democratic messaging that's not uniquely held by white voters. They're the sort of voter that would be gettable for Democrats without compromising on a racial justice agenda if it is sold as the United States continuously striving to close the gap between reality and its values. But Levison adds there are a number of cultural issues on which cultural traditionalists and extremists align, and Republicans have become adept at using them. He defines them as pride in their culture, background and community, respect for tradition, love of freedom, belief in personal responsibility, character and hard work, and respect for law, strict law enforcement, and the right of individual self-defense. In other words, they express the same sensibility as the women in the group who wanted to teach their children a positive history of the United States. One suburban Black woman in the group put it this way: our kids should be taught about slavery and all of that awfulness, but America is also a good country, and that's what I want my kids to learn. Few people read the full 1619 project put out by the New York Times in 2019. I did. And there's essays in there, and there's reporting about the role of slavery in the development of the United States, but for the most part, the idea of replacing and rejecting 1776 as the date of our birth and supplanting it with 1619 as our true founding is so controversial that it was ultimately deleted from the 1619 project. It is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, they were to tell you this fact? which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, is wrong, and that the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August of 1619, guess what? That wasn't enough blunting for most of us. Liberals often suggest that parents who are skeptical of the 1619 projects reject the idea of teaching the truth about American history. More often, as with the woman who was in this focus group, it's a question of framing rather than truth or lie. Believing or conceding that we as a people are defined by the worst of the past might be some truth to that, but the concession is seen as cutting off any hope of a better future. And as an adult, if that's the view you've come to, it's more than understandable. But we want our children to remain hopeful about the possibility of a better world. Even Democrats want that, since it's the world they'll inherit and build after we're all gone. The argument that slavery was essential to the development of capitalism in the U.S. is a well-established scholarship by this point. But absent a call to overthrow capitalism, that notion, particularly when compressed into something of an elementary school student, could absorb, it loses any meaning beyond nihilism. And of course, parents of all races reject the framing, and they look at the Democrats as a party of elites who seem to be blithely suggesting, they're not really meaning it, the overthrow of a capitalist system that benefits them before all others. And if they're not suggesting that, then what are they suggesting? Democrats need to learn and then need to lean into the kind of patriotic statements that make many progressives recoil. Democrats have the potential to split extremists off from traditionalists by couching democratic values as truly American and extremists as un-American. An example of this rhetoric is to say, I love the American flag as much as any American, but I would never use a flagpole flying or flag as a club to assault other Americans that I call my enemies. That is not the American way. But they don't say that. They don't say, the values I grew up with are good values, and I want them to endure. But the values of the people who want to turn Americans against each other and divide our country are not my values. Why can't they say things like that? Well, because they don't believe them. And at the end of the focus group, the women were asked if they'd ever consider changing their vote if Democrats had passed the infrastructure bill. The bill, which was passed by the House, is something that Virginia Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat, has claimed would have helped win the election from McAuliffe. 91% of the suburban women said no. 9% said yes, and one woman laughed and said, "What does that have to do with anything?" She's right to laugh, but that 9% actually points to something hopeful. In a close race, a 9-point swing like that can matter. If Democrats had passed the reconciliation bill as well and could talk about universal pre-K or the child tax credit, clean energy investments, and subsidies for child care, they might have won back some voters. And if Democrats were in touch culturally, that swing could get even bigger. The idea that we need surveys to tell us what's wrong with the two political parties is kind of insane. You don't need anecdotal evidence or real evidence. What you do need is to think about this. The great left hope, as we've been told, lies in people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a woman who may be well educated, but who fundamentally has no connection to white working class American women, or for that matter, to other Hispanic working class American women. This woke message, as even Bill Maher, who is as liberal as you can get, has pointed out recently and challenged AOC to come on his show to debate this whole woke cancel culture thing. This message does not resonate with people. You're seeing more and more women, whether they're very educated or moderately educated or even relatively undereducated, deciding that they don't like the idea that your opinions could get you fired from your job, or that your refusal to take a vaccine could get you fired from your job. These things are just not sitting well with even the most liberal of people. So the idea, therefore, that you would use the squad as a way of coercing middle-of-the-road kinds of Democrats further to the left is just a really bad idea. In today's debate over critical race theory, it's impossible not to hear echoes of the past. Democratic elites are creating conflict within the working class while protecting their own class and their own cultural interests. And we saw that with Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed segregation in schools. The 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act had banned residential discrimination and empowered the federal government to forcibly integrate neighborhoods. In 1973, the Department of Justice was actually suing Donald Trump and his father for racial segregation in their housing, which they settled 2 years later. But that same year, a Gallup survey asked Black residents to choose from a list of preferred solutions to school desegregation, and the top choice was the most intuitive: neighborhood integration and an end to redlining. Think about that. That was more important than busing their children or having white children bust into their schools. Neighborhood integration would require, however, that we all learn how to live together. And how do we all learn how to live together when we keep being asked to pick a side? Biracial kids are asked to pick a side. White parents who can't afford private school, they're asked to pick a side. Creating new school districts along racial lines and creating gerrymandered districts in Congress, that's asking white, working class, middle class, Black voters and middle class Latin voters to pick a side. Because if they remain in the cities and the professional class all flees to the suburbs, well, guess what? There's not going to be any coming to terms or coming together. Today's white Democratic elites are also confronted with school systems that have substantially resegregated, persistent racial income and wealth gaps, and test scores that reflect those patent inequalities. What difference does it make what the color of the child sitting next to your kid is if your kid still can't read by the time they graduate high school? Gallup found in 1981 that 60% of Black voters, they were disappointed in public schooling. Now, how does that help the Democrats? It doesn't. Black parents, just like white parents, just like Hispanic parents, all want their kids to have a chance to go to the best schools. So when the Democrat Party aligns itself with teachers' unions and school board unions and all the rest of it, and doesn't listen to what the parents of Black and Hispanic and Asian American kids, what their parents actually want is school choice. And while they buck that every possibility publicly, that's a death knell. It really is for the Democrat Party. And I'll tell you something else. You have to start admitting, if you're a Democrat, that you are losing the war when it comes to elections. If you know that your party continues to tell children that this is not a good country and that they don't have a chance, they're either part of the oppressors or part of the oppressed, you give these kids a very dark picture of the state of the nation. Frederick Douglass talked about that a long, long time ago. And that's something cultural traditionists can all get behind. Start quoting people like Frederick Douglass and stop quoting people like AOC. If you want to reach the middle of America, be they white or Black or Hispanic or Asian American, then you have to start speaking to everybody from the same place. It's not about race in America anymore. It's about socioeconomic status. And we don't want to address that. So we look down our noses, or at least the cultural elites do, look down their noses at the white working middle class. This is a proven failure. Democrats, beware.